Welcome to the Private School Leader Podcast, where private school leaders learn how to thrive and not just survive as they serve and lead their schools. I strongly believe that it is possible to have a long and happy and fulfilling career as a private school leader. And my passion is to help you figure out exactly how to do just that right here on the Private School Leader Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Minkus. So I'd like to start today's episode with a quote from George Bernard Shaw. And he once said, "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place." The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And I want you to think about you at school and you've just wrapped up a difficult meeting. Maybe it was with a parent or maybe it was with a teacher that you're putting on a performance improvement plan, but you have this difficult meeting. You reached for the courage when you didn't have the confidence. You said things that were hard to hear, and now the meeting's over and you just feel this huge sense of relief. Well, there's no worse feeling than finding out the next day that the parent actually didn't get the message. Or there's no worse feeling than finding out that you and the teacher are actually not on the same page. So you went through this meeting, you had the difficult meeting, you said the things, but because of poor communication or poor listening on that person's part, whatever the case might be, the message did not get through and you are not on the same page. And so that's where this quote comes in. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. But we're going to push past that, and I want to talk on today's episode about a framework, and it's called the 7-38-55 rule. And the 7-38-55 rule is a kind of a framework for effective communication that claims that 7% of communication is conveyed by our words, 38% comes from our tone of voice, and 55% comes through body language. So on today's episode of the Private School Leader Podcast, we're going to discuss how to use the 7-38-55 rule to have better conversations with your parents and teachers. But just before we jump into that, I want to say thank you for listening to the podcast, and I have a free gift for you, and it's called the 5 strategies to help you work with difficult parents. And so we know that working with parents is part of the job, part of what we do, and most of our parents are fine, but some of them can be demanding, and some of them can be emotional, and some of them can be kind of difficult. And so I've created a guide for you that will help you with this. And if you go to theprivateschoolleader.com/parents, you can grab this guide, and hopefully it will make a difference as you lead at your school. And that's the 5 strategies to help you work with difficult parents. And you can get that at theprivateschoolleader.com/parents. And then I also, just for a moment, want to remind all of us, remind you of something that you already know, and that is being a private school leader is a very, very, very difficult job. Our jobs are oftentimes relentless and they feel unsustainable. And I know personally that back in 2010 that I was in pretty rough shape. I was in the hospital with ulcers. I kind of had lousy relationships with my daughters and with my wife. And I was actually thinking about getting out of school leadership altogether. But I made some changes and I figured out how to make it better. And I can teach you how to make it better, because you don't have to make all the same mistakes that I made. And I can teach you how to go from surviving to thriving. And I can teach you how to have a long and happy and fulfilling career as a private school leader. And the way that I can teach you that is through an online course called Thrive Academy. And it has taken all of the things that I've done, all the things that I've learned over 32 years, but especially the things that I did, the strategies that I used to go from where I was to being fulfilled and happy and looking forward to going to school every day and having a sustainable lifestyle at work and at home. And so you can check out Thrive Academy at theprivateschoolleader.com/thrive. And that's Thrive Academy at theprivateschoolleader.com/thrive. So I started today's episode by giving you a quote from George Bernard Shaw. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So we're going to get rid of that illusion. We are going to get clear on ways that we can communicate clearly. And we are going to, if we're going to do the hard work of communicating and having those difficult meetings and saying the last 10%, then we're going to make sure that effective communication actually occurs. And I want to say that I have an opinion that as private school leaders, that effective communication has never been more important, but it's also never been more difficult. Never been more important and never been more difficult. So let me explain what I mean. First of all, I think it's never been more important. And I said that, we want to be on the same page with our parents, with our teachers, with our staff. But I think that it's so important because we are so busy and because of the time crunch that when we do communicate, that I feel like in general, the amount of time that we have to do so is less because of the time crunch, and that there's pressure to get it right. And it's so important to build trust and build relationships. But poor communication, the reason it's so important to have effective communication is poor communication at best will lead to hard feelings and distrust. And at worst, it could actually lead to litigation. So if you have a meeting and, let's say it's a performance improvement plan or even a separation of employment type meeting, or a discipline meeting with the parent of a child who is going to receive some discipline, like a suspension, if we don't communicate clearly, like I said, at best, we have hard feelings, distrust, maybe they withdraw from their child from the school, but at worst, it could lead to a lawsuit. So we want to effectively communicate. But I also said that it's never been more difficult to communicate effectively. Well, why is that? Well, first of all, because of all the distractions. We've never been more distracted with cell phone notifications and push notifications from social media posts and just all of the noise that we deal with in our lives from our devices. And then we have the emotion. And there's emotion on our part, but there's also emotion on the part of the teacher because of, maybe feeling a lack of trust, or, they are worried about losing their job, or things that are going on in their personal life. But there's also emotion when it comes to the parents, and they're emotional about their children, quite understandably. And I did an episode on parent communication. It was episode 2 or 3. I'll link it in the show notes. And I talked about the wall of mutual distrust between school administrators and parents, and how we have to take bricks down off of the wall of mutual distrust. So all of these things are making clear communication more and more difficult. There's a couple of other things that make it difficult. Right now, I think that we live in a very, very contentious society, and it seems like everyone on social media is angry, and that everything is kind of like this debate culture or playing a game of gotcha when it comes to the things that we say, and that we just feel like we have to choose our words so much more carefully than we used to because of how people will react to it. And then another thing that's a barrier to effective communication is people that listen with the intent to respond. And so if we do that, and let's face it, we do that as private school leaders because we're in this mode of problem solving, and we start solving the problem while the person's still talking, but the brain can only effectively do one thing at a time, and listening with the intent to respond is not actually listening. And so hopefully I've made the point that in today's society, in today's private schools, that effective communication has never been more important, but it's also never been more difficult. And so if those things are true, then we need tools. And one tool that we're going to talk about today is this framework that private school leaders can adopt called the 7-38-55 rule. And the 7-38-55 rule was created by a UCLA psychologist named Albert Mehrabian. I think I got that right, Mehrabian, in 1967 at UCLA. And what he put forth is that communication consists of 7% words, 38% tone of voice, and 55% nonverbal cues. And you may have heard of the 738-55 rule, but I want to start by just telling you that this rule is very, very often misapplied. And it's often, like if you were to Google articles on 738-55 rule, you're going to find a lot of things about job interviews or about making a sale or negotiating a business contract. But actually, that was never Dr. Mehrabian's intention. The 738-55 rule works when people are expressing feelings, not facts. So let me hit you with that again. The rule works when people are expressing feelings, not facts. And so in a job interview, in making a sale, in negotiating a business contract, there's a lot of applications in the business world. And it's like, yeah, you want to read body language and nonverbal cues and things like that. But this rule is most effective when it applies to emotional work. So the good news is that what we do in our schools is emotional work. And most of the time when we're talking to parents or to teachers or staff, that we're using our emotional intelligence and the feelings come into play. And then the second time that this rule applies most accurately, first of all, it's when someone is expressing feelings, not facts. But secondly, it is when when the signals are in conflict. And so what that means is that if the words are not aligned with the nonverbal cues. And so let me give you a few examples. So your spouse or partner says, "I'm fine," but every other thing with their body language and their tone, they sure don't seem fine. Or you're talking to a parent about something that's really, really serious, like a suspension, and they're like laughing and joking around like they just don't get it. And so there's a disconnect there, or the signals are in conflict. Or you're in a staff meeting and you're excitedly talking about a new initiative at your school that the teachers have been excited about in the past, but you're talking to them about this, that we're finally launching it, and then all of the body language of your teachers are just blank, no emotion, or just really, really restless, or they look like they're upset, and you're just trying to figure this out while you're up there talking. So you know what I'm getting at, and you can probably think of other examples right off the top of your head where you're talking to someone, you're talking about something that has emotion attached to it, but the person, when they're talking, their signals don't align. And so their words don't match their body language or vice versa. And so when those things are happening, and let's face it, the two things I just described, that happens all the time in our jobs as private school leaders when we're having these kinds of conversations. When those things are in play, the 738-55 rule is incredibly useful. So it's useful for focusing attention on what's most likely to provide us accurate and valuable intel in situations where it's hard to read the other's intent or emotions. And so when in doubt, we're going to lean more heavily on tone of voice and body language than we are words. And when the body language and tone conflict with the words that are being said, we're going to apply this rule. And so, like I said, this is the zone in which we live so often in our jobs, where these things are in conflict. So here's how private school here's how private school leaders can leverage the 738-55 rule to have better and more effective and more meaningful conversations with parents and teachers. Okay, let's start with mastering verbal communication, which is 7%. Mastering verbal communication, 7%. So I want to make sure that we don't minimize our word choice or to perceive that our word choice is unimportant, because in this 738-55 rule, it's the smallest number. Even if our words only form a small percentage of communication, their impact is huge. And so we're going to, as private school leaders, we're going to strive for clarity, conciseness, and relevance in our communication with parents. So let me give you those three again. We're going to go for clarity, being concise, and relevance. And so part of relevance comes with being prepared. So we're prepared with relevant information. We know the facts about the situation. Now, if a parent's coming to us and they're telling us how they feel and they're giving us information that we're hearing for the first time, that's a different story. But if we're meeting with a parent and it's about a complaint or about a discipline issue or something like that, we need to arrive to that conversation with the relevant information. Similarly, if we're talking to a teacher about their performance, we need to have the relevant information, whether it's notes from an observation or, they've been late this many times or this many times they didn't update their grade book or just whatever it is. We want to keep the conversation relevant, but also clarity. I think that sometimes we use indirect language and because we're trying to be nice. I know that's a problem for me when I just need to be more clear, and Brene Brown says all the time, clear is kind. And I couldn't agree more. And then the other thing, and this is something that I need to work on, is to be concise. Sometimes I over-explain or I over-apologize. And so what we're going to try to do with these words that we're going to use in this conversation, we're not going to just be dismissive of the words because in this rule 73855 that they are a small percentage. We are going to focus on clarity, being concise, and relevance when it comes to our word choice. And that'll help us frame those messages. The last thing I would say is to try and keep it positive and constructive, and also to try to just eliminate the emotion from the words, detach emotion from the words, and to just, proceed with those things in mind when we're choosing our words carefully. Okay, so that's the 7%. And then the 38% is attending to tone of voice. So 7 was our words, and 38 is tone of voice. So let's think about this for a minute. I think that our tone of voice carries significant weight in conveying meaning and emotion. And so what are we going to strive for? Okay. When, as private school leaders, we're going to pay attention to our tone, and we're going to aim for warmth, empathy, and professionalism. So let me give that to you again. So, I was already talking about tone, but how? It's all great that we talk about words and tone and nonverbal cues, but specifically, what are we talking about? Okay, I'll get specific. I'm talking about warmth, empathy, and professionalism. And so, let me elaborate. A friendly and reassuring tone can help to build trust and rapport, even when it's a very, very difficult conversation. So if we're going for warmth, that can be friendly and reassuring, but professional. It's not overly friendly. We're not yucking it up here at a bar or at a social gathering or at watching a football game on a Friday night. We're having a professional conversation in a professional setting. And so we're aiming for warmth, empathy, professionalism. And of course, that empathy can be communicated with our tone of voice. Tone of voice can come across as very authoritarian. Our tone of voice can come off as dismissive. Our tone of voice can come across as warm and empathic. And so I think that it takes some practice. It takes some thought and intention. I think that if you've listened to the podcast for any length of time, you know that the word intentional is a word that I use often. And so we need to be intentional about our tone of voice. All right, so we've talked about the words, we've talked about the tone of voice, and now we come to the 55%, which is understanding nonverbal cues. So words 7%, tone 38%, and nonverbal cues 55%. So we know what nonverbal cues are. Facial expressions, body language, gestures, are your hands, do you have your palms open and it's sort of like an open and welcoming body language that you're implying, or are your arms crossed and you're kind of not making eye contact? Well, that just sends So let's just pause there for a minute. So you're sitting across from this person, hopefully at a small table rather than, behind a big desk and them in a guest chair, visitor chair. But you're sitting there, and let's say the same exact words and the same exact tones. The words that are coming out of your mouth and the tone of voice is exactly the same in scenario A and scenario B. And the only difference is that in scenario A, you're kind of leaning forward a little bit, you're making eye contact, and you are, let's just leave it with those two. You're just leaning forward a little bit and you're making eye contact, okay? That's scenario A. Scenario B, same exact words, same exact tone, but you're kind of leaning back, slouched a little bit in your chair. You have your arms crossed, and you're making very little eye contact as you're talking and as you're listening. So the words are the same, the tone is the same when you open your mouth, but just that difference in body language, I think that when you are visualizing scenario A and scenario B, you can see that you're sending off these vibes of indifference, or like this is a waste of my time, or what the parent is saying or the teacher is saying is ridiculous and you disagree, just from those gestures. And so you're like, okay, Mark, I get this. This is like communication 101. But I am telling you that I feel like it's so important to go back over this and to be very intentional about it, because we're so busy, because we're so crunched for time, and sometimes, quite honestly, because we've already kind of made up our mind about a situation before we have a conversation about it. And so, again, leaning into those nonverbal cues, we should be mindful of those nonverbal communication cues when we're talking to parents. We want to have an open demeanor, and we want to appear to be open, approachable, and attentive. So I gave you kind of like 3 words for when we were talking about the words that we say, and I gave you clarity, conciseness, and relevance. And then I gave you 3 words when we were talking about tone of voice: warmth, empathy, and professionalism. Well, here's the 3 words for the nonverbal cues: open, approachable, and attentive. So if you just think about that, open, what's open body language? Well, it's eye contact, it's nodding, leaning forward a little bit, your hands or you're not crossing your arms. If you're using hand gestures, your hands are open. If you're seated, most of the time when we have these kinds of conversations, we're sitting down, but if you're standing, you have kind of an open stance, and again, the palms open, and that supportive posture, and it just signals engagement, it signals interest, it signals that what you're saying is the most important thing to me right now. And then here's the last thing that I'll add on this point, and that is that I'll speak for myself, but I think this is true for a lot of people, is that I get more nervous depending on how difficult the conversation is. So if it's a difficult conversation, a performance improvement plan, or a separation of employment, or, I need to kind of like either give a consequence or a stiff warning, like to a teacher, or take it to a parent level. Let's say that I have to tell them no about something that they want, or I have to tell them some news about their child that they don't want to hear, or, it's something about a discipline issue that they, disagree with, that the consequence is too severe. So the bigger the thing is, the more nervous I get. And I don't know about you, but sometimes that nervousness shows, and sometimes I want to just get the meeting over with, and sometimes I want to just kind of speed through it. And my point is that we just have to kind of take a step outside of ourselves and kind of check our emotions and think about all of the things that we're talking about here, and just be like, okay, are these things showing in my body language? Okay, so very quickly then I want to just say 4 ways that we can get better at applying the 7-38-55 rule. And so some of them will be, revisiting some territory that I touched on briefly when I was explaining the rule. So 4 ways we can get better at doing this. Number 1, active listening and empathy. Just remembering that effective communication is a 2-way street, and we're just going to give that full attention, and we're going to just also, I think it's important to think about our location and our environment. Active listening is all well and good, but if our office or the place we've chosen to have this meeting with this parent or teacher or staff member or student is a high traffic area and there's a lot of interruptions on the walkie-talkie and the phone and all that stuff, there's all this noise and all this interruptions, that's not allowing us to do what we want to do, which is active listening. So I think active listening and empathy is something that we sometimes don't think about as location. And then number 2 is building trust and rapport. Number 2 on our list of ways that we can get better at applying the 738-55 rule. So building trust and rapport, we know that trust is the foundation of the meaningful relationships in our life. And if we think about the most important relationships in our life, those are people that we trust and they trust us. And so if we consistently apply the principles of this rule, we will build trust and rapport with parents, and we will create an environment where open and honest communication happens more often, and then those relationships can grow. And then number 3, we want to provide clear and timely information. And so I really believe that communication is most effective not only when it's clear, but when it's relevant. We talked about that before, but when it's timely. And so what I'm getting at is that we need to make sure that our parents have access to, important information and updates and school policies and the handbook and procedures that are in a format that's easy for them to understand and easily accessible. So do they have to go on a scavenger hunt to look at the school handbook that was shared back in late July or early August? And proactive communication can prevent misunderstandings and alleviate anxieties. And so clear and timely information. And then the 4th tip on how to effectively apply the 738-55 rule. The 4th tip is just seeking feedback and continuous improvement. So, our school every year, there's a parent survey that goes out in late spring, and there are many questions in it, but one of the questions is, how are we as a school in general doing with our communication to parents, but also in particular, how are the administrators doing as far as timely, how quickly we're getting back to them, how effectively we're communicating, how we're resolving their issues. And, if we don't ask, we're just going to probably assume that things are fine, but we need to seek that feedback, and that will help us to improve our communication. Okay, so the big takeaways from today's episode are we're talking about the 738-55 rule that was created by UCLA psychologist Albert Mehrabian in 1967, and he suggests that communication consists of 7% words, 38% tone of voice, and 55% nonverbal cues. But we talked about how this 738-55 rule is often misapplied, and when it is most effectively applied and what the original intention was, when people are expressing feelings and not facts, and when the body language and tone are in conflict with the words that are being said. And so again, I think I described things that happen often in our private schools, and that's why I think this 738-55 rule can be helpful. And so with the 7%, the words we say, we're going for clarity, conciseness, and relevance. And then with a tone of voice, the 38%, our goal is warmth, empathy, and professionalism. And then with our nonverbal cues, the 55%, what our goal is there is we're going for being open, approachable, and attentive. And those will be in the show notes to help you kind of circle back to that. So I like to end every episode with a call to action. And so your call to action for today is to pick one of these 3 things, either the words, the tone of voice, or the nonverbal. Decide which one you need the most work on, and then just pick one strategy and apply it. And even just with the strategy, let's say that you want to work on your nonverbal cues, you could pick one from open, approachable, and attentive. Maybe it's the attentive. Maybe you're really easily distracted by your phone or by the noise in the hallway or just whatever. My point is that you go back through, you think about the 3 parts, the words, the tone of voice, the nonverbal cues. You pick one that you think needs the most work, and then you just pick one strategy and you apply it and you try to improve in that area. That's your call to action for this week. And I want to pass along another free resource for you that I think can be super helpful. And this is called the Top 6 Ways to Protect Your School from a Lawsuit. And I've created a 10-page PDF that can help keep your staff and students safe and help keep your school out of court. Litigation is expensive and time consuming. And this 10-page PDF is a common sense guide that will help you to be more intentional and more proactive as a school leader. And it's called the Top 6 Ways to Protect Your School from a Lawsuit. And you can get that at theprivateschoolleader.com/lawsuit, privateschoolleader.com/lawsuit. And then one more reminder, I've created a new online course called Thrive Academy. And if you want to have a long and happy and fulfilling career as a private school leader, that's not going to happen by accident. And it's not going to happen unless you get really intentional about your boundaries and your time management and your productivity and your relationships and your physical health and your mental health. And I can hear what you're saying. You're like, yeah, right. I don't have time to do any of that stuff. Well, then you're headed for burnout. You're headed for survival mode. And Thrive Academy can get you back on track, or it can send you in your career in a direction that will be long and happy, fulfilling, and sustainable. And it's broken down into 7 modules with 39 lessons. There's over 9 hours of video content, but it's broken down into bite-sized lessons where you can go through the 86-page workbook, lesson by lesson, strategy by strategy, and there are guided notes and reflection questions and calls to action and habit tracking calendars and everything you need to take this online course, apply it, and go from where you are to where you want to be as a private school leader. And you can check out Thrive Academy at theprivateschoolleader.com/thrive. That's theprivateschoolleader.com/thrive. And I'd love to hear from you, so shoot me an email at mark.o.minkus@gmail.com. And a new episode comes out every week. You can find that wherever you listen to podcasts, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. And if you could rate and review the podcast, it will push that out as suggested content. The algorithm will to leaders all over the world. Thanks to you, we're in 54 countries now, and this content is helping leaders literally all over the world. And the show notes for today's episode can be found at theprivateschoolleader.com/episode 79. You can connect with me on Instagram at theprivateschoolleader or Twitter at thePSleader. And most importantly, most important is that this episode or this podcast helps you. But I really, really, really would appreciate it if you would share the link to this episode or the link to this podcast with another school leader in your life. And then think about at your school, who's an aspiring leader? We're going to be entering into an era very shortly where we're going to have a major shortage of qualified heads at private schools in North America. And so these aspiring leaders that could benefit from this content, you could be the one that shares that link with them and gets them on that path. So if you could share the link of the podcast with someone in your life that's a leader or an aspiring leader, I'd really appreciate that. And I've been your host, Mark Minkus. I just want to say that I just appreciate you so much and all of your hard work and dedication that you're pouring into the lucky kids and teachers at your school. And I also appreciate you taking some of your precious time to join me here today. And I'll see you next time on the Private School Leader Podcast. And until then, always remember to serve first, lead second, and make a difference.